Good morning, and welcome to our webinar on messaging to Republicans on climate and clean energy issues. I'm Nathan Crabbe. I'm the editor of the invadingsea.com. The Invading Sea is a nonpartisan source for news and commentary on climate change and other environmental issues affecting Florida, and is managed by Florida Atlantic University's Center for Environmental Studies. We're going to be recording this webinar and posting it on the invadingsea.com in the days ahead, in case you want to watch it again or for those who missed it. Floridians are more convinced that climate change is happening than Americans as a whole, and strongly support steps to address its impact, according to an FAU survey that one of our panelists is going to be discussing today. But there continues to be partisan divisions on climate and energy issues that can be widened by the way that we talk about these issues. Our panelists today will be presenting polling and offering their views and ways to bridge these divides and make it easier to reach consensus on climate policy. Rather than introduce the panelists myself, I'm going to have each of them give their own introductions and jump right into today's topic. So let's start with Colin Polsky from FAU. Colin, why don't you introduce yourself and kick things off?
Thanks, Nate. I'm Colin Polsky. I'm a professor of geosciences at Florida Atlantic University. This is my 10th year here at FAU. This year, I started a new role as the founding director for the new environment school here at FAU called ECOS. My background is as a climate social scientist, so I'm interested in how people create, perceive, and respond to climate change. All right, very good. So as I said, I'm at FAU, Florida Atlantic University, and one thing we've been doing here is running a semi-annual statewide public opinion poll on climate issues in Florida. So we call it the FCRS, Florida Climate Resilience Survey. And so I'm going to share just a few pertinent results here for today's topic. So the kind of punchline here is where I will begin. And it may seem surprising, but in Florida, as a statewide matter, cross-political party, virtual unanimity on the question of, is climate change happening? Of course, the other related question of what is the cause is not nearly, does not show nearly this level of consensus. But from a policy and politics perspective, when you hit 90% on something that used to be lower, certainly nationally, you probably have some wind at your back. On that other question of what are the causes, here are the results from do you believe climate change is happening and is largely caused by human activity? There's a lot here. I'll just summarize it very briefly. Basically, as I said, we have 9 waves, 9 surveys already conducted, dating back to fall of 2019. Our most recent wave came out a few weeks ago. And what we see here, the blue line in dots relate to the Democratic Party, people self-identifying as Democrats. The red is the Republicans. The green are the non-party affiliates or the independents. And we have to remember in Florida, if you're a politician, you really need to take into account independent perspectives. As heterogeneous as they may be, there are a lot of swing voters in this state. The black line is the total number for the state. The takeaway message here is that the total number is hovering in the 50s, 55, 56, even in March, hitting 65% of all Floridians thinking that climate change is not only real, but it's also caused by humans. For the purpose of this conversation, with the Republican number, the red line, is hovering in the mid 40s to high 40s. So that's not exactly a majority, but it's certainly, we feel, higher than what you see on the national scene, at least according to some polls. And it may help explain some of the significant activity in Florida in recent years on climate under virtual unanimous Republican control. The next slide here is getting into a little bit where the rubber meets the road. You know, people can acknowledge something is existing and even being a part or driven by human activity. But when it comes, say, to paying taxes to try and address the issue, here we phrased it as how willing are you to pay $10 per month to strengthen Florida's infrastructure to weather extremes? And here again, look at the red line. We're over 50%, well, between the low 40s and the mid low 50s. So that's, you know, in the zone where it's almost a virtual toss-up in terms of the Republican electorate. And, you know, the Republican Party is typically the party of low to no taxes. And so I think this is suggestive. Here is a slide showing the results of our most recent survey where we asked which source of energy do you think Florida should pursue and support? And there were a number of choices or options that people could choose. This is most of them, I think. It may be all of them. Natural gas is on the left, solar is next, going left to right, wind, then nuclear, then coal, and I don't know. So the takeaway here is that there's pretty dramatic support statewide, 55%, 47% of Republicans supporting solar. Another takeaway is that nuclear, which is often discussed, especially in conservative circles, is at 12% of Republicans, which you might say isn't a tremendous vote of confidence, but it's certainly larger, I would say significantly larger than the other portions of the Florida's voting base here. So I think the final slide I have that I want to show at this point is the results from a question we've asked now twice following the passage of the summer 2022 Inflation Reduction Act by Congress. And the question was, how strongly do you support or not the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course is dominated by climate fighting measures. Here we have Republicans on the left, NPA, non-party affiliates to the right, then Democrats in the total. What we see is more than half of the total electorate in Florida is supporting the IRA last March, and the number declined a bit across all of these different tabulations to last month. On the Republican side, we were at 40% and now we're at 34%. So that's not a resounding vote of support, of course, but it's, you know, larger by a factor of 3 than the Republican support for nuclear, for example. So the main messages here, very briefly, are grounded in the data and also, though, built on some of my experiences and interpretations. And so very quickly, Florida, with its Republican support for climate and energy issues, may be the first big red domino to fall nationwide. That's a proposition, we can test it, and that's something that I'm interested in doing. The dominoes, if they do fall, may reverse our wild pendulum swings. And so what I mean there is at the national level, and since 1988, we've had going far left and far right, and then further left and further right, depending on who's in power in DC. And that's just not helpful, and it's not a good use of time or money. And the third takeaway message here is that the climate left should stop condescending and start listening. And so that's a whole avenue that builds off of this data set, but it's something we can discuss. In any case, thank you all for organizing this and having me here.
Thank you, Colin. Let's jump to Lori Weigel from Newbridge Strategy. Lori, why don't you introduce yourself and present some of your research as well?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I think you guys can tell from the fact that I'm wearing sweaters that I'm not in Florida, but delighted to be here and talk a little bit about some of the research. I've worked in public opinion research for 3 decades now, and my firm's roots are in Republican politics, having worked for 2 of the major Republican political polling firms, but I consider myself to be sort of a conservative conservationist. And so I've done work on climate change and energy and a host of other conservation related issues over the last few decades. So this survey that I'm going to share is nationwide. So we don't have enough to be able to talk about Florida specifically, but I think a lot of what Dr. Polsky just talked about is very much in line with what we've been seeing in some of our work. And just wanted to share and compare and contrast a little bit some of the work that we've seen among voters overall, American voters overall, and then looking at Republicans specifically. So this was a nationwide survey, so representing all 50 states proportionally. So obviously Florida is a little bit of a bigger chunk of that than some other smaller states. And then we did additional interviews with Republican voters that but again, it's proportional based on partisanship as well. So nothing's out of whack because we just wanted extra confidence in our Republican voters. So one thing that we've looked at is just really, where do voters want to see action taken? Obviously, having a president on the Democratic side can affect Republican voters and how they're feeling over time. And we've definitely seen some fluctuations in terms of wanting to take action on certain issues based on what is the party in power in the White House. The other underlying constraint, of course, too, is that lots of voters, especially on the more conservative side, don't want government to do a whole lot. So this is a little bit of a loaded question right off the bat. But you can see that in terms of some of the top tier things that we're seeing, we're definitely seeing wanting to reduce reliance on foreign oil. That's been a consistent theme for many, many years. But one that has sort of emerged in the last several years is ensuring the reliability of the electric grid. We've got 3 in 5 American voters saying we're not doing enough right now on that respect, and very few saying we're doing too much. Infrastructure overall has been a drumbeat theme since even before President Trump came in, and has continued through the Biden administration. And the latter two are ones that I think are important to point out. They are top tier overall, but they are a little different when we look at them by party. And so while we get Republicans at the national average or even higher on the 3 that I just talked about in terms of reliance on oil, reliability of the grid, or infrastructure overall, we get a much more partisan response for things like reducing pollution or addressing climate change, where Republicans are half as likely to say that we're not doing enough to address climate change as American voters overall. And we'll talk a lot more about this as we go through. That said, if we ask them, and this was one where we split the sample in half, and half were asked about the United States government, half were asked their specific state government, and what they should be doing to take action to reduce the carbon pollution that contributes to climate change, and whether they support it or oppose that. And you can see that, again, we get a bit of a partisan response, but we still have a majority among Republicans, in fact, solid majorities, saying that, yeah, they support taking action to reduce the pollution that contributes to climate change. So framed slightly differently, they tend to be more supportive. Again, Democrats are overwhelmingly supportive, and we've tended to find that independents or those without a party affiliation are somewhere in the middle here. And then they also actually, it's kind of important to note that when they're asked about the impact that taking those actions to address climate change would have on their view of their senator or their governor and how they respond here, I think the important thing here is simply the proportions that say less favorable. While they are higher among Republicans, they are not nearly at the intensity level that we tend to see would be something that would drive people away from a particular elected official or candidate for public office. So very little intensity in terms of the much less favorable views. Even among Republican voters, and for the most part, pluralities are telling us that they'd be more favorable overall, especially once we get to the broader electorate. So a little bit of insight. We've got a lot more we can share, but I know I want to pass it over to our next panelist.
Thank you, Lori. And we're glad to have George Riley join us as well. He's with Conservatives for Clean Energy. George, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and give some opening comments as well?
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. And thank you for allowing me to be part of this panel today. And I apologize for the Zoom issue. It was not allowing me to log in under one of my Gmails. So we had to straighten that out. But my name is George Riley, and I'm the state director for Conservatives for Clean Energy Florida, and I'm located in Tallahassee. I am wearing a sweater today. It's a little colder than usual in Tallahassee. Um, but I've been the state director since February 2020, and CCE Florida is part of the Conservative Energy Network, which is a network of affiliate groups in 24 different states. And we all, in general, believe in increased choice and competition in the energy market. And we believe that in all the above energy strategy, like diversifying our fuel sources, makes our country and state stronger and more resilient. Uh, Prior to being the state director for Conservatives for Clean Energy Florida, I served as the executive director of the Republican Party of Florida from 2016 through 2019. And I got my first job in Republican politics in Florida in 2008 and have been involved one way or another with Republican politics here in the state ever since.
Thank you very much, George. And I see some people are already putting some questions into the Q&A in the chat, and that's great. We'll be getting to those questions in a little while, but I'd like to kick things off with a few questions of my own. Laura, you specifically mentioned some issues that Republicans tend to be more supportive of, specifically reducing the nation's reliance on foreign oil and ensuring the reliability of the power grid. I mean, what kind of messages have you found to be most effective on connecting with Republican voters on these kind of issues?
Yeah, so I think one thing that we tend to see, sorry, and I'm going to get this pulled up so that you guys can see a few highlights of what we've tested in terms of messaging and actual words that actually connect with people. And that is one of the things that we've seen is that Republican voters want to hear, or conservative voters broadly, they really want to hear a more solution-oriented messaging. They react very negatively to sort of a doom and gloom. The sky is falling, climate chaos, a lot of even calling it a crisis, and some of that language can really turn off more conservative voters. And so what we've seen is addressing some of their underlying concerns and problems tends to be something that resonates much more strongly among that segment of the electorate. So I mentioned, and here I'll share my screen so you guys can see some of the exact language we've used. When we've talked about modernizing the grid, that's a theme that has resonated everywhere. I was just recently in Texas, and so it has particular resonance there, but it is something that has been important to voters broadly, but especially to conservative voters throughout the country. And lots of them do point to what they've heard about the issues that Texas has had or California has had with some brownouts during different times of year. But really the idea of it being reliable, being able to handle extreme weather, they tend to feel that our infrastructure broadly throughout the country is outdated. And so they very much feel that it applies to the electric grid as well. Now, I will say this, most people don't understand exactly how the electric grid works and all the ins and outs of that, but having a more secure electric grid, more secure from hackers, more secure from, everything really is something that they'd like to see happen and that they want to see particularly addressed. And then, like I talked about, it's definitely true with oil, but just broadly, they want to have American-made energy. They feel like that's going to build a stronger economy, a stronger nation, and that this made in America approach to energy that includes not relying on any one thing, but having a diverse mix of energy sources is something that really resonates. They feel like that's going to be more affordable and it's going to be more reliable. And those are two things that top our list of concerns among voters. And then along with that theme, American manufacturing, building the stuff here. And really, we've tested different nuances in terms of language. I'm just giving you one example, but definitely, you can see America 3 times in here, and they want American workers to be working on these types of innovations and products. I will say that a lot of people are not aware of manufacturing that's occurring or new plant openings or things like that in their state. That might get, it might be on the business or it might be on their LinkedIn, it might be in that type of press, but it's not something that they're seeing necessarily already as a result of some of the incentives that have been put in place. So, these are just a few things. I've got more talking about jobs and they like tax credits. So generally, I will say that I think one question already asked, do they know what's in the IRA? No, not necessarily. But when we prompt them and tell them some examples, they are pretty positive about the idea that's incentive-based or tax credits. And conservatives love energy efficiency. That is something that we've seen for decades. They hate waste. They don't want to see it. They talk about walking around after they're teenagers and turning out lights and things like that. And so that cost savings and efficiency and lack of waste is something that they'd love to see put into their own homes. It's familiar. It's not some new weird technology. So that's just a few highlights of what we've seen in talking to conservatives that have resonated more strongly with that segment of the electorate than sort of the broader electorate overall.
Thank you, Lori. I might ask another question or two and then turn it over to the questions that we're getting from the viewers. And so can keep adding those and I'll get to as many as possible. A couple of them were about Governor DeSantis and, the first Republican debate of this election season. Governor DeSantis, there's a question asked about climate change from a young conservative, and Governor DeSantis kind of shut down that discussion, and it really kind of fizzled out after that. We published a column on the invadingsea.com today from someone with the chairman, in fact, of the Florida Federation of College Republicans, basically saying, hey, I want the Republican presidential candidates to really take this issue seriously, offer conservative solutions on them, with a debate coming next week, another Republican presidential debate coming next week in Miami. This would be a perfect opportunity to do so given the climate challenges we face. So I'd like to get the panelists' thoughts on this. Maybe we can start off with George. It seems that these are messages coming from young conservatives in particular. Is there an opportunity with young conservatives on these climate issues? Is there more, and from what you've seen, more enthusiasm for really taking charge and addressing this issue in the Republican Party among young conservatives?
I think at the very least, we have to show that, we at least care about this issue and aren't ignoring this issue. There's a good group that's been around for at least 5 years or so now, the American Conservation Coalition. They've done great work. They've set up chapters at various colleges and universities. And it's a group of young conservatives who are concerned about the environment, about conservation, and about climate issues. And, quite frankly, Republicans aren't showing enough effort that, what are we doing to address these issues? And that group, ACC, I believe, went to Milwaukee for the first debate, and they were very disappointed that I don't think one question was even asked about the climate at the first debate. So we have to take baby steps. We have to show that we care. We have to show that we are doing stuff that we do care about conservation. Now, is it going to be at the top of the list for the average Republican voter? It probably won't be. Republicans care much more about the economy, about taxes, about inflation. But we have to figure out, how do we appeal to the younger generation? How do we appeal to those in purple districts in Seminole County, Pinellas County, parts of Miami-Dade? And the environment definitely serves as one of those bridge issues that we need to discover, how better to message. And I don't think we are ever going to make progress in terms of messaging if we get into Republican primary voters about why they're the cause of man-made climate change. We're going to appeal to them by way of, how does it affect their quality of life, and how does it impact them economically?
Thanks, George. Yeah, I mean, get back to something that Lori mentioned, and I think you just brought up again, is just this idea of doom and gloom versus focusing on potential solutions. I think that something that Lori mentioned that was brought up in a recent Washington Post article is the idea of using the term climate crisis or climate emergency or some of these terms. I think scientists are becoming using these terms increasingly in the papers that they published, according to this Washington Post story. Colin, in terms of that, what have you found in terms of using those terms versus kind of taking a different approach and focusing on solutions instead, and how that resonates with people?
I don't think it's terribly effective. I haven't read that Washington Post article yet, but I do see kind of a trend from within the scientific community of increasing urgency, shall we say, to describe the situation. And personally, I do view the situation as urgent, and so I'll share that. But there is also a sense of fatalism that can settle in with anyone, human nature, conservative or liberal or moderate. If the messaging is consistently the sky's falling, whether it's subconscious or not, I think there's a risk that people will say, well, then what good is action? What can I do if it's already game over? And, in my view, it's not game over. We are in a pretty pivotal and acute moment as a country and as a world on this issue. So we do need to speak, I think, alternatively, more to optimistic outcomes. And the only way I think that we're going to get there is something that hasn't really happened. And that is by having, and this is going to sound terribly naive, but having conversations, good faith conversations from people representing the full political spectrum on the solutions. Right now, I think the perception is, and probably rightly so, and probably not surprising, given the polarized nature of government these days, is that one party's writing the legislation and the other party opposes it because that's what they're supposed to do. And then when the power is switched, it's the other party that's reversing that legislation with no input. So we're absolutely not going to get anywhere unless there's some good faith conversations across the spectrum.
Okay, thanks for that. And let's open things up to questions from the audience. And for all these questions, I'm going to throw them out there, and maybe all the panelists can take yourselves on mute, and we can have more of a conversation on this where we can go back and forth, and everyone can offer their opinions. The question from one of the viewers is, how should we go about appealing to conservatives in our state when some of those prominent politicians they follow are avid at denying climate issues as well as promoting less reliable and riskier methods? I guess I might reframe that a little bit. There has been more of a focus in this state on things like coastal resiliency and adaptation than dealing with the causes of climate change, dealing with carbon emissions. So, is just going to get some opinions from our panelists here. What is the way to appealing to conservatives in this state? Do you think that it's kind of focusing on these adaptation measures, or is there a role to play to say let's also tackle or have messages out there about tackling carbon emissions and that sort of thing?
Well, I can start. Sorry. I do think that, well, it's interesting. We tend to shy away from saying resilience as a term because
it's a big term in Florida. So
I know it comes up all the time, all over the country. Resilience means something bad has already happened to most people, and that we're bouncing back from it. And so, really, what they want is like prepared communities. They want people to be prepared when something bad happens, and ideally reduce the risks of something bad happening to them in their community. So it's all resilience. It's just maybe how you frame it a little bit sometimes is more helpful. We've definitely seen that is one of the least partisan aspects, and so obviously that's why lots of people are tackling it. Is they want to make sure that that we are prepared for some of the more frequent and problematic storms. Depends on where you are. I've done work on wildfire all throughout the West and in some states that are experiencing that more and more. So that is sort of the minimum and one of the least partisan aspects that we see people wanting. But they do want to see that we're addressing and having solutions to carbon pollution. Now, I will tell you this, that they don't always necessarily connect that to climate change, but having a broad mix of energy sources is, again, something that people support, whether or not that has anything to do with climate change for conservatives.
So you said the term carbon pollution too, and I guess we're talking about messaging here, and I guess I wonder about the distinction. Is calling it carbon pollution rather than carbon emissions or something like this? Is that a term that generates more wanting to take action? And when I hear pollution, I want to take more action on it than emissions, which seems a little bit less.
Yeah, I think generally what we've seen. I mean, we had those questions that Dr. Polsky talked about, what's causing this? What we'll tend to see when we sit down and talk to voters is that they'll say, well, okay, maybe it's not all human cause, but probably we have some impact on this, right? So they'll take this little bit of a middle ground, and we have very, very few, even among conservative voters, that are just saying, no, I flat out deny that humans are having any impact on our environment. So they're willing to say, okay, we ought to be doing this, and it could be for a myriad of reasons. And climate change may not be at the top of the list for our more conservative voters, but things like public health, things like, there's often many, many co-benefits of any of the solutions that will address climate change. And those can have greater resonance sometimes for Republican and conservative voters than but it's still, all of those solutions are still going to help address and reduce the impacts of climate change. So it's really what's number one versus 3 or 4 can vary depending on the party, but it's still the same set of solutions.
Right. Well, and Dr. Polsky, some of your survey information that you put out there was about the different energy categories, and George, you can chime in on this one as well. It seems that that there is a lot of support for solar in this state, and when you get to some of the differences between the parties, it's things like nuclear tending to be supported more by Republicans than by Democrats. What have you found in terms of either of you? What kind of energy sources that conservative voters out there are more enthusiastic about?
Well, I just would reiterate what I said earlier, and what you just said there, Nate, is solar is, as you could see by the bar chart, it really dominates the interest among Florida's electorate in terms of which future energy source we should be supporting. And what I found in conversations as well is that the clean energy concept writ large appeals really across the spectrum pretty readily, especially since in the last few years, we've had such a precipitous drop in the cost of the technology. And that's why you see, even though in the state of Florida, the state is not actively supporting shifting energy production away from fossil fuels, you see the market driving the producers, who are not part of the state government, the utilities, to shift. And so they say, it just makes economic sense. And so what we're seeing here, if their promises end up coming true in the coming 10 to 20 years, is a radical shift in the carbon emissions from electricity generation in this state, with essentially no support from the state government.
Yeah, and I guess I wonder about George. Maybe you can speak to that. Is that you see Dr. Polsky's polling showing that there's this enthusiasm for solar, even on the IRA. It's while Republican voters are less enthusiastic about it than Democratic voters, that they're still it's not overwhelming. Yet you have Governor DeSantis vetoing or not monies that are coming from this from the IRA for energy efficiency and that sort of thing. You heard Lori say that energy efficiency is something that Republican voters tend to be enthusiastic about. So one of our questions kind of gets at this is how do you address that disconnect when you have our state's top leader, top Republican, and Republican presidential candidate, taking these actions, and yet um, among the electorate a different view. How do you reach out to conservatives on these issues when the top Republican in the state is singing a different song?
Look, I think you need to show the average Republican voter how is it going to affect them economically? How is it going to affect their pocketbook? And then they'll start to care. I'm reminded. I remember back in 2008 when I first started getting started in Republican politics. I was knocking on doors in Pinellas County. It was the time of the Republican convention in Minneapolis. We had the drill baby drill chants going on at the convention. We had bumper stickers that said drill baby drill. And you would talk to people door to door, and this was even in Pinellas County, and they were just so sick and tired of the high cost of what they were paying for fuel that they were ready to have an oil well in their front yard if you would let them. So if we can show how solar is going to save them money, how clean energy is going to save them money, how it's going to produce more jobs, I think that is a much more effective message. And if you can show them that, they will come around.
Yeah, one of the questions, in fact, asks how can we make the connection between climate impacts and their drag on economic growth to raise the level of interest among conservatives? Do you think that's one way of doing it? I've seen so many studies out there talking about if we don't address it now, it's going to cost more later. Do you think that's an effective message among conservatives?
I do think it's effective, maybe not as effective, but I think it's definitely a route that we should take.
Okay. So one of the questions mentions the polls show erosion in support for green positions eroding from both Democrats and Republicans in 2023. Reasons why. So Dr. Polsky and Lori both, it seemed like there was a little bit of a dip at the most recent of some of those survey results. Are we seeing anything differently because of the presidential campaign or anything else that's kind of causing more partisanship on these issues? Or do you have any other possibilities on kind of maybe why we're seeing a little bit of a dip more recently?
Well, I'll just say quickly, this is in the area of speculation, but it does seem, first of all, that the numbers do fluctuate a bit from one moment in time to another, and the reasons seem to be linked with other issues. I think George said earlier, climate is never going to be the top of people, or at least Republicans' set of concerns, and I would say the same thing applies to Democrats. There's one war underway that we're involved with, another one more recently started. There's persistent concerns about inflation. And so people are thinking about a lot of things. And but for me, the message from our most recent poll is still the same, is that there's really a good bedrock of conservative and Republican support for climate in general. I think the messenger about the issue might need to change for translating that support into votes on the floor of the U.S. Congress, but that's a separate matter.
Laura, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I will say that when we sit down and hold focus groups and just have a much more open-ended conversation with people, there is a lot of misinformation out there. A lot of it's targeted at wind and solar, especially wind. But, we're seeing it with electric vehicles, just sort of concentrated attacks on some things that we used to see very little partisanship on. I remember a focus group in Missouri many years ago, and this one was like, I want one of those zippy little cars to drive around in. And now we're hearing about batteries catching on fire and, just a host of things. I mean, some of those are real, but they get spread around in terms of social media. They get talked about on Joe Rogan, so there's this sort of separate conversation that's taking place that is very isolated sometimes from what the broader mainstream media is talking about. And that comes up a lot in terms of what people are hearing about. And, I mean, there's some, there's normal like range anxiety when it comes to EVs and, some things like that. But there's just these little, it's sort of like playing whack-a-mole. I don't know if anybody ever played that game in a carnival or fair or boardwalk, but, I mean, we hear one concept and then, you combat that and then another one pops up to take its place. So there's definitely some misinformation that's affecting voters. And some of this is, sometimes after a discussion group, I sit down and have to Google some of the things that we've heard because I hadn't heard about that one yet,
Yeah.
and you find it in lots of these different issues on energy and especially right now on electric vehicles.
Sure. Well, we're almost out of time here. First off, I'd like to thank all the panelists for joining us today. I want to thank Race to Zero for helping to promote and put together this event. But let's, before we conclude, maybe go around for some closing thoughts, and maybe we could even incorporate one of the questions from the viewers in your closing thoughts. And that's a question of how do we market long-term solutions? It seems to appear that voters mainly listen to short-term solutions, and I think that is one of the central questions of all this. If we're talking about preventing things from happening in the future, people obviously are thinking about their immediate circumstances, their immediate costs for different things. They don't want to pay more for things, even if they know it has a long-term benefit, even if they know if it's going to save them money in the long term sometimes. So maybe in your closing remarks, you could also address how do we kind of appeal to people that tend to think in the short term when on an issue that has a lot of long-term effects. Maybe start with Dr. Polsky, Lori, and then George can conclude.
Well, thanks to everyone for organizing this and attending. I guess I'd answer that question a little bit with a sidestep, in the sense that those challenges are going to persist on any topic, including this one. I think we can mitigate it and minimize the effect of that if we change the messenger. And so I said that a minute ago. What I mean is, it seems to me hard to imagine a significant increase in conservative votes on the floor of the Congress unless the thing they're voting for appears to their voters to have been influenced by conservatives. And so at the moment, the dominant discourse on specific policies and actions really does not seem to be coming from conservative voices. And so I don't think we should go to the other extreme and have those discussions be only influenced by conservative voices, but there needs to be a mix so that people feel like their voices are represented.
Thank you, Colin. Lori?
I do think that voters are starting to understand, but there's still been a very deep lag in terms of understanding that solar is more cost effective, for example, than it ever has been. People tend to think of rooftop solar first, and they know there's like this big investment that has to take place. They don't really understand the ideas of, large scale solar installations and things like that, and how it's actually more cost effective than some of the traditional fuels that we have relied on in the past. So I do think hopefully eventually that message is going to get out there. But I will say the other thing that we've noted, and this actually came up in 2020 when we were doing lots of online groups talking to people about climate change, because we were sort of forced into that format. But finally, I just asked people, what is long-term to you? Like, what is a long-term problem? And I think you'll be shocked. The average was about 10 years. Long-term was 10 years ahead. So people are very immediate, but their sense of what we ought to be doing to address long-term problems is not 50 years in the future. It's 10 years down the road. And so those changes that we can make and showing them that this can happen in that sort of time frame is pretty important to convey. So yeah, that's just a couple ideas. We could talk about this for 3 hours, couldn't we?
Definitely, and we're planning on having more webinars like this, so we want to continue the conversation. George, why don't you conclude this webinar today with some thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, long term, we need to appeal to conservatives devotion to their family and to their future generations, and about how, you know, we need to be good stewards of the land. We want to be able to hunt, we want to be able to fish, and we want our children and their grandchildren to be able to do that as well. And there's no reason why Democrats should have a monopoly on this issue or be allowed to have a monopoly on this issue, when I say that conservatives care just as much about the environment as anyone else.
Well, thank you. I appreciate all of you again for being here today. And with that, we'll conclude. Like I said, the invadingsea.com will be posting this video on the site for those who missed it or want to watch it again. Thank you all for watching, and have a good day.